I hope that I will be able to deliver a few ideas. First, I would like to thank to all the other speakers and also attendees. I think that in some aspects I will be picking up from what Virl was saying, though I will try to give an outlook which is in some sense less personal, but only as a bridge in order to get really, really personal. And I think that I was reading about learning and unlearning. I was a little bit annoyed. And because it's immediately associated in my mind to a certain model of ourselves as having a kind of a memory, an hard disk or library kind of memory in our heads, and then there are contents that we learn, and then we have to unlearn them in order to load again other experiences or skills, etc. And this is a little bit, this learning and unlearning was a bit, was somehow looked to me a bit too local in the way I want to think about it. And so I started to free associate from this annoyance. And one thing that I came up with, and this is like the starting point that I want to make, is we are all made of memories all along, body and mind, and this memory is just as a first approximation. What are memories? Memories are patterns that are persistent in time, but more accurately, they are persistent relative to one another. And there are complexes of memories. And just for example, in our bodies, in our cells, there are these DNA patterns that are at the cellular level, there are racial kind of memories or patterns. More specific is the variations that we inherit from our parents, our body structure, our different inborn abilities, movement habits, and then we can start reviewing experiences and relationships between patterns that form these relationships, complexes of relationships form either even more intricate patterns. And there are, of course, linguistic patterns that we are in habit of repeating. And there are preferences of sights, of smells, and sounds. Of course, a huge repository of complex conditional associative relationships. And these are all to different levels and different extents, and it is quite hierarchical in this sense. They form certain cultural memory patterns that are required through interactions with parents, with peers, with other humans, through imitation, resonance, etc. So this is the image that I was starting to think about it. It's like a huge complex of persistent patterns, and as organisms, as thinking, experiencing organisms that we are also autonomous agents, we of course interact with the environment all the time. We are affecting and are being affected by everything around us. And with this, within this scope of interactions, I can speak about two descriptors, two major descriptors that are like one countering the other, but they are not really countering one another. One is openness, and the second one is closeness. So what is closeness? Closeness in the sense of us being memories of us being persistent patterns is the fact that certain patterns create or self-organize into complexes where each one of them is triggering the onset of others. So they create some a type of self-persistent, self-organized, or autopoietic, if you know this term, at least in the biological sense, autopoietic complexes that become, in some sense, but not in an absolute sense, immune to disturbances that are originated in our interactions with the environment. And our sense of identity is basically this closeness, meaning it's all those patterns that arise from these self-organized processes, and these patterns are persistent, but they are only persistent in relation to other patterns. So it's all very, very relative. We don't have here any kind of an absolute reality in relation to which all this description is being made. So, and this is like the basis of the sense of identity and the sense of agency, this closeness or the ability to create loops of persistent patterns that are, one is triggering the other, A is triggering B, which is triggering C, which in turn triggers back A, and it of course can become very, very complex. And the other aspect, the counter aspect, is what I call openness, is the fact that our life is always, as agents, as autonomous agents, are always interconnected to an environment, and we are constantly affecting and are being affected by our environment. So this environment is all the time, if you wish, disturbs, but in a more neutral word, it perturbs these processes or patterns of identity, and is causing them to change. Maybe slowly, maybe faster, but in this sense, in the context of education and learning, and I will come to it very shortly, the way that I try to think about it is that our sense of identity is on one end very, very strong, but in fact, it is, at least to some extent, illusory. It's illusory not in the very fact of its existence, but in the significance and the kind of absolute constancy that we sometimes relate to it. And in this sense, we are more becomings, rather beings, and we are more individuating rather than individuals. And this is very important when we come to speak about interactions under the title of education or learning or unlearning. And now to be a little bit, one more thing that I want to mention in relation to it is when we speak about memories or persistent patterns, what we really speak about is about repetition. certain patterns are being repeated, and we always become more the patterns that are repeating more, and we become less, or forget if you wish, those patterns in us, the patterns of interactions that are becoming less and less, more and more scarce in our interactions. But there is another aspect of our interactions with the environment which is exposed when we start to think about how individuation happens, is this aspect of intensity or significance, because we know that even a single event or an interaction in our life can have an effect which is carried away along all our lives. Meaning that something which is very intense, an impression or an experience which is very intense, is like a big stone that we throw into a pond, and it creates a lot of waves, and these waves is meeting other patterns that reflect them, and this is an event that can go on and go on and go on and have many secondary and tertiary effects. So in this sense, when we speak about repetition, these memories as a persistent patterns in our lives, we have to pay a lot of attention to this very intricate and almost mysterious relationship between intensity on one end and repetition on the other end. Intensity can create a lot of repetition, like the most known example is a trauma which happens, and then it repeats itself in many behavioral patterns and thoughts and emotions and ways of perceptions, etc. So it becomes very embedded in all our interactions. On the other end, there are cases where repetition of a certain pattern condenses into something which is intense. And for this, just take for an example like a pianist or a musician that trains for years and years and years, and then there is one performance which creates a huge impact for the listeners. So in his interactions, in such a musician's interactions, repetition has been condensed into a certain quality. And these relationships between repetition and intensity, I think is very important, and it can even in what I heard that Verl was saying, there is an underlying reference to such relationship. Now, just to relate this to learning and education, if we think about young human organisms, young minds, but also adult minds, I'm not speaking here about content of education, neither about sets of values, etc., but about the very dynamism of the interactive process of individuation. And in this sense, what we call education is an extremely challenging concept. And what I mean by that is that education is supposed to be a more or less intentional intervention with a direction. It's not just anything goes. It has a direction in the individuation of another human being, another entity. And of course, all the interaction regime that we think about taking place between young minds and educators is very asymmetrical. And this asymmetry is also in itself problematic. How are we going to do it? What is it that we can, I struggle pretty much with this idea of education if I want to take it a little bit beyond accepted ideas. So thinking about a school like the Buckminster College, I believe that the most important view is that the whole staging of such intervention in the form of a school or a lesson or a game is itself an individuating situation. It is also a conglomerate, a complex conglomerate of interactions, of repeating patterns. And it is an individuating of a more or less contoured body of repeating patterns or memory. And now the question is, what is to be repeated? How much variation we think is allowed or beneficial in this repetition? Because there is nothing like repetition without variation. All repetition is based on variation, and maybe what shouldn't or must not be repeated. So this is how I try to distill a very impersonal understanding of this educational process. And what I came up with in just continuing to associate with this idea of learning, of education, of this educational interaction within this construct, is what becomes extremely handy, and I will try to convince you about it, is the concept of story. As a first approximation, a story is actually a scaffolding structure for this whole dynamism of individuation. And a good story, what I would call a good story, is a cosmos unto itself, and it highlights and exposes affordances and constraints. And in this sense, I think that the most important thing is to teach young mind to listen to stories and to tell stories, and use this use stories as what I call mind vehicles that facilitate one's own autonomous ongoing development, embedded and of course embedded and embodied within an interactive environment. And stories are themselves patterned memories, yes, but they have a very special kind of qualities. The first one, maybe the one that I see as most important, is that stories enable us to introduce consciousness, reflective consciousness, I mean, into the dynamism of individuation. In every well-constructed story, the agent occupies at least two positions simultaneously. One position is the storyteller, the one that tells the story, and And a second position is those aspects within the story that present a point of significance or points of significance into which the storyteller projects himself or herself merely by telling the story. And a similar relationship is formed in the mind of a listener. So what storytelling enables us to do is to create this particular reflective situation where our individuation becomes embedded within a field of consciousness. And in a sense, a story being a form of reported speech, it introduces into interactions at large, which is how memory patterns changes, which is how our individuality, our identity is changing and interacting. And if we really are able to employ this storytelling device, I think that at a certain point, all interactions, direct and indirect, start to have a story component inside them. A story aspect which expands the presence of consciousness and allows to become conscious and allow us and students to become conscious participants in their own process of individuation. And one side effect of this mechanism is that it allows us, on one end, to be situated and embodied in the moment within the interaction, which is the most important thing, but it also allows us to travel away from this situated here now into other places, other times, and other realms, and to embed also them into the situation. And thinking about learning, unlearning, all this turns a whole circle about this kind of very old and ancient technology that we are using in our everyday. Sometimes we are not even aware that we are using them, of telling stories, listening to stories, and using stories as scaffolds of how we interact and individuate. And we just move from one story to another, to another, to another, just jump. And each one of them is a scaffold, but can be also be left behind, not forgotten, but just left behind because it does not serve anymore. And then we have another story. And just as a footnote to my attempt to give this description, that even what I'm saying now, all these minutes, it's also already a story. So it is a kind of intervention. It has a direction. And in this sense, it is affecting, and also I'm affected by just communicating it. So it is in itself a demonstration of how it can work within a situation of not, okay, this is a school, so this is a school. What are the givens of schooling activity in our minds? It's there are a lot of ideas about it. There are wonderful theories. But beyond or below all these theories, it's how we are able, if we are able at all, to make young minds active participants in their own individuation. So that was my my thoughts about this, the topic of this seminar.